nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashujitan Purna Prema Rasutsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananam Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamritapayo Rasho Mudake Bande Bhagavatani Mananudabam Murdna Nipatyakshito. Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Namah Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambujo Radha Madana Mohano Kuladi Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gosvami Dasa Raghunath Adadana Strinam Dantoye Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dulisam Janma Janmani Raganugami Bhajano Dasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasada Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Kamala Shrita Chetasam Me Sata Chittam Satam Madhukariyatu Padapadme Yaram Yanikilaga Sangha Shamani Shrotratitim Sangata Yasadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dikkarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajanda Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava Charjas, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali, and in particular, Sriman Mahaprabhu's celebrated advice, Tṛṇād sunīcena, taror sahiṣṇunā, amāninā, mānadena, kīrtanīyaḥ, sadā hariḥ. So in our last reading we continued discussion of the quality of being tolerant like a tree, and in particular we looked at Chakravarti Pad's analysis of how various qualities that are integral to being tolerant like a tree are codependent on one another, and how fundamentally all of these qualities are dependent on absorbing the mind in bhakti, or absorbing the mind in Bhagavan by means of engagement in bhakti. And then we looked at those instructions in the 12th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, where for those who are unable to completely absorb the mind in meditation due to a lack of purity in the psyche, how contemplation, concentration, and practices involving the external senses, such as hearing and chanting, are prescribed for persons according to what is suitable to their stage and disposition, such that one can acquire these qualities whereby one can become free from, or engage in bhakti free from aparad. So today we'll conclude that topic, which pertains to the relationship of all of the qualities required to be free from aparad, and its relationship with sadhana bhakti in general. And then we'll finish the topic of tolerance like a tree and come to the fourth and final quality in the verse, that of humility. So I'm starting where I left off in the previous file. considering the implications of this explanation by Sri Chakravartipad of Bhagavan Sri Krishna's enumeration of the qualities of his bhakta, it may appear to give rise to a catch-22. A bhakta's qualities of tolerance, non-conceitedness, and so forth are considered to emerge as a result of engaging in acts of bhakti. That was what was taught in the commentary of Chakravartipad. And yet, in the verse under discussion, which is a prescription for how a sadhaka should engage in kirtan and other acts of bhakti, this verse enjoins engaging in acts of bhakti with those very qualities that are said to emerge as a result of engaging in acts of bhakti. How can one take up a practice, the necessary means to engage in which is attainable only as a result of having already performed the practice? This is the apparent dilemma. So the resolution to this apparent dilemma, in other words, it's not actually a dilemma, it can just seem like one if that's how you frame it, but that's not exactly how you want to frame it. So why not? Because the resolution to this apparent dilemma is found in the principle taught in Srimad Bhagavatam that bhakti is the cause of bhakti. Bhaktya sanjataya bhaktya. Sri Samipad explains in his commentary on this statement that bhakti as a sadhana, that is, what Sri Rupa calls sadhana bhakti in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, gives rise to manifestation of bhakti, the characteristic of which is prema, that is, what Sri Rupa calls prema bhakti, and what Sri Jiva Gosvami calls sadhya bhakti, that is, the form of bhakti that is the object to be attained by sadhana bhakti, the initial manifestation of which is known as bhava bhakti, and the complete manifestation of which is known as prema bhakti. So just for, those who are fond of Sridhar Swami, it's interesting that this whole progression of bhakti being one element and yet subdivided into three elements that lead to a self-manifestation of its full form, which is, you say, the core line of thought of the Purva Vibhag of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, could, or at least appears to be, drawn directly from this statement of Sridhar Samipad in his commentary on the Bhagavatam. So this, to me, this is my personal 2 cents, is one of another instances in where many of the very core elements of Rupa Goswami's presentation are drawn directly from the pre-existent work of Sridhar Swami, or rather you could say developed from them, from a particular perspective. So as one, reads the Goswami's works in the light of Sridhar Swami's Pad, how indebted we are as Gaudiyas to Sridhar Swami, and how much adoration we feel for him as we more and more recognize that debt. We feel satisfaction in our hearts to acknowledge that. Anyway, Sri Rupapad goes on to explain in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 1.3.11 that a bhakta's qualities of tolerance, non-conceitedness, and so forth are indications or anubhavas, that is, evidential expressions of the appearance of bhava bhakti in the heart of a bhakta. Thus, it is to be understood that these qualities emerge in the mind and behavior of a bhakta to the extent that one engages in and progresses in sadhana bhakti, such that bhakti's self-manifestation into the heart becomes all the more developed. A sadhaka lacking in these qualities is prone to committing offense, and thus is advised by Sriman Mahaprabhu in the verse under discussion to engage in sadhana bhakti with these qualities so as to avoid committing offense as far as possible, even though the sadhaka may be lacking in these qualities. So in other words, it's not unknown that these qualities are rare or that they're not easy to practice. And so it can be understood that this injunction is being given to people who may not have a great degree or a high volume of these things. So that's understood, or rather, it's intentionally even for the people that may be lacking in these qualities that they're prescribed to practice sadhana with them. The idea being that by simply doing that sadhana, they will gradually acquire these qualities, and with the awareness of their importance, there'll be a coordinated psychological effort to foster and integrate them into one's thoughts and behavior as one continues with the principal activity of engaging in Shravan, Kirtan, Smaran, and so forth. So, executing this instruction is thus typically difficult for a sadhaka whose mind is yet to be greatly purified, and sadhana is thus felt to be a challenging struggle. To the extent that a sadhaka perseveres through this struggle and successfully practices bhakti free of offense, to that extent the sadhaka will be purified and thereby further qualified for the practice. In this way, it is engagement in acts of bhakti that is the cause of acquisition of these qualities, and it is thus the sadhaka's responsibility to both acquire these qualities by means of sustained practice of acts of bhakti, like hearing, praising, and meditating upon Bhagavan, and to act in accord with these qualities in the course of their practice of these forms of bhakti, to whatever extent these qualities have been acquired. So even if you have, if you're going to do business, whatever amount of capital you have to invest it, and, earn with that, and then from what you gain, further invest, gain more, and little by little your capital increases. So something like that, as they say, it takes money to make money, so to speak. It takes purity, or it takes these qualities to do bhakti, and yet you have to do bhakti with whatever little capital of them you have, and by putting in that effort and by persevering through the challenges that arise, then little by little that capital increases. So it's not that it's impossible or that there's a fault in these instructions. As we know, there's a principle hermeneutic that no injunction given in the Shastra is ever considered to be impracticable, because it's taken as a principle or an article of conviction in the meaning of Shastra, that the Shastra would never give an injunction that's not actually practicable by the audience it's intended for. So whenever there appears to be something enjoined that's not possible to do, one either has to figure out how one has misunderstood what's being said, or one has to consider that perhaps whatever's being said is not actually in the Shastra, because if it's from the Shastra, it will be something that's practicable. This is a point that's used in Chakravarti Pad and Jiva Goswami Pad's analysis of various points. So, in that respect, then, even if you might say it's impossible to be humble like a blade of grass, well, nevertheless, there's a 1% possibility of doing it a little, therefore it can be, so to speak, enjoined, with the idea being that by doing the principal act of absorbing the mind in bhakti, then more and more the capability for that will unfold, according to all the things we discussed in the previous class. So this is the resolution to the apparent contradiction. So that applies to qualities in general. So now we'll finish this quality of tolerance like a tree with a final exception. Or in other words, we've heard about such extreme description of how tolerant one is and can be, but does that mean that there's a completely open gauge and that anything and everything is meant to be tolerated? Is there anything that's intolerable and that doesn't fit that scope of great tolerance that a Vaishnava has? So there is, and that's the last point made here. Finally, on the subject of tolerance like a tree, the extent of the range of behavior to be tolerated is also to be understood. While a tree has been said to tolerate extremely austere conditions and even attacks against itself, the ideal application of the quality of tolerance, which the characteristics of a tree are discussed for the purpose of illustrating, does have some exclusions. And the principal exclusion is the very thing that the quality of tolerance is meant to protect one from, that is, offense. This is to say that the quality of tolerance, the purpose of which is avoiding offense, should not be misapplied in a manner that one ends up committing offense by being tolerant. So you might say, well, how is that possible? Usually it's by tolerating that you refrain from committing offense. But here's the exception. For example, listening to defamation or ninda of Bhagavan's bhaktas is an offense, or aparad, as it is said here in the Bhagavatam. Upon hearing defamation of Bhagavan or persons devoted to him, even one who does not move away from there loses one's merit and falls down. So this verse is cited by Rupa Gosvami and other acaryas to show that hearing ninda is an aparad just as speaking ninda is. So if someone is speaking ninda and you're hearing that, to tolerate that is to implicate yourself in aparad rather than free yourself from aparad. So every behavior or practice always has to be applied in accord with its ultimate objective or the ultimate purpose that it's meant to fulfill. And this is in many cases where what you get, what they call dharma samkat, or dilemmas in the path of dharma arise, is when people they lose sight of the specific purpose of a particular behavior that's largely understood to be virtuous, and in an attempt to be virtuous, actually end up committing an act that's not virtuous. Such as there's an account in the Puranas of, I forget her name now, the mother of Shukracharya. I can't remember her name just now. But she, on one occasion, was visited by some asuras who were guests and who sought shelter in her home. So she, following the principle of dharma of honoring the guest as Bhagavan, or honoring the guest as a recipient of the highest respect, and also providing shelter to those who seek one's shelter as being also an incumbent or a compulsory duty, that if someone asks you for hospitality but has hospitality of their own otherwise, you're not necessarily duty bound to give it. But if someone comes to you and says, I have nowhere else to go, I'm in distress or danger or abject need, and to deny that shelter to someone who's in explicit need of it when you have the means to provide it, that's also considered a transgression of the dharma. So on these two accounts, she gives shelter to these asuras who came to her. However, while then residing in her home for some time, those asuras went about committing numerous acts of adharma and were greatly disturbing many of the sadhus and devas and so on, such that they sought the protection of Narayan from these asuras. So Narayan then came and saw that they were being protected by Shukracharya's mother, whose name I can't remember at this moment. And so he approached her respectfully and said, Mother, these asuras are causing great acts of adharma. I need to stop them from doing that. And it's not proper for you to give shelter to them, because by giving shelter to them, you're aiding and abetting their acts of adharma. So this created what you might call a dharma samkat, or a dilemma in the course of dharma for the mother of Shukracharya. Because on the one hand, to oust a guest and to oust someone who sought shelter in you is considered to be contrary to the duty of a host and the duty of someone who provides shelter. So you can't do that, so to speak. But on the other hand, to aid and abet people who are committing wrongs and disturbing society in general is also not acceptable according to the Dharma. So you're faced with a situation where, at least on one level, you have to go against one principle of Dharma in order to follow another. So this is the samkat, or the dilemma that one was in. And she decided to stick to the duty of a host and the duty of a shelterer, and continued to support and even protected these asuras from Narayan, such that she inhibited Narayan from stopping them from committing the acts of a dharma that they were doing. And so to protect society in general, Narayan told her that if you don't cut out of the way and stop protecting them, I'm going to have to remove you from the way. And she refused to do that as well, and Narayan ultimately used his Sudarshan chakra. So this is an instance where by performing this act of support or this act of dharma ultimately implicated one in a type of offense. So the same idea applies here, that in the name of being humble or in the name of being tolerant or in the name of being respectful, all of those qualities are for the purpose of avoiding offense and satisfying Bhagavan. But if such a situation arises where being humble or being tolerant or being respectful implicates one in causing offense or turns out to be displeasing to Bhagavan, then one has to have the knowledge of the, quote, subtlety of Dharma or the shukshmata of Dharma to know when and where what is to be applied according to the ultimate hierarchy of purposes that are fit to be pursued, or have a clear understanding of what one's ultimate ideals are. So this is the background on this principle. So it's just finished out as follows. Thus, in the name of tolerance, one should not neglect to avoid or avert hearing defamation, that is, unwarranted discussion of a Vaishnava's faults, such as those related to the circumstances of their birth, those that occurred prior to their taking shelter in Sri Bhagavan, those related to accidental, unintentional, or unknowing wrongs, and those that are almost rectified. In other words, one shouldn't engage or listen to discussion of Vaishnava's faults, or specifically defamation of Vaishnavas, or the ascription of fault to them that's unwarranted. However, that also is not an absolute principle, and in that regard, there can also arise a quote-unquote dharma sankat if one neglects to hear or discuss such information when it actually is one's duty to do so. So without a worthy purpose for discussion of such subject matter, such as in a case in which some responsibility rests, that needs an S, upon oneself for the immediate personal well-being of the person with the fault, or someone directly subject to the effects of the fault, one should avoid listening to any discussion of the faults that may be observable in a Vaishnava, and should not rather tolerate it even though one finds it unpleasant and unbefitting. Similarly, one should not allow other acts of tolerance to implicate oneself in any other forms of offense to Vaishnavas, deities of Bhagavan, or Bhagavan's name. So, without going into numerous examples, just, one basic example is given to illustrate the principle. So tolerance is definitely a virtue, but every virtue, every quality has a range of application. Samatam yoga uchyate. Yoga is balance, or applying everything within its ideal range of intended application. And even good things, when they're applied outside of their intended range, can turn into things that are not so good, or even adharmic. So that concludes our discussion of tolerance like a tree. And now we'll take up the fourth and final quality mentioned in the verse, that of being far lower than even grass. So I'll pause here if anyone wants to make any comments or ask any questions on that topic of tolerance like a tree. Before we move on, then I'll just allow time for that if anyone wishes.
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
Hello? Yeah, so you mentioned earlier in the very beginning about you give this comparison of by having money. It takes money to make money. It takes purity to become pure. It takes bhakti to create bhakti, and so on and so forth. So basically, it's not new what I hear, but on second thought, someone may have so little of substance that may not be able to really progress. And seems like from this simply stated that not everyone is effort is rewarded proportionately because of the lack of basic fundamental qualities. So what it tells me that everyone's effort towards obtaining prema is vastly different. Someone may, make little effort and obtain it. Someone makes lifetimes and obtain it, or not. I don't know. So basically, I just make a point of that. Just I'm not questioning anything. Just have to voice out, and we can develop on that.
Yeah, well, I'll just say that ultimately we hear that bhakti is something that one acquires from a bhakta, and that comes by grace, and that is the greatest fortune to receive. So it is, a precious capital, if you will, that ultimately another invests in oneself, or a sadhu, motivated by the bhakti within their heart, may be so kind as to grace someone else with some experience or some association or some advice which furthers a samskar for bhakti in their mind, and then it's up to the person to cultivate that, but according to the condition of their psyche based on their own past journey, they may or be more or less inclined to do so, more or less capable of doing so. And thus, in the case of some, they might make effort at that, but the amount of capability they have to do well on that may be much less than another. So just as, if we go back to the money analogy, some people are, born in a prosperous country, some people are born in a very poor country, some people are born into an economy that's stable and people can trust each other and make loans and deals, and other places you can't do that because people aren't trustworthy, and there aren't systems in place to ensure that people that follow the law and so forth, and so everything becomes harder, and thus the sad reality of the world, if you will, is in some places people work much harder to get much less than other people work to get much more when they're, have the privilege of being in a prosperous place and in a safe environment and so on and so forth. So similarly, in a given lifetime, someone is, born in Vrindavan, from birth, filled with samskaras for bhakti, and everything is, they speak the language, they're born into the culture, they naturally like it, they have everything going for them, whereas other people are born on the other side of the world, they're fit up with a culture that's completely opposite to that, their head is caked with all types of, samskaras for stuff that's antithetical to bhakti, they don't know the language, they don't know the culture, everything they're doing is an uphill battle, so to speak. So you might say that's not fair, but from the Shastric perspective, in the multi-lifetime journey, everyone is where they ought to be in the course of that, and the ultimate route is unscrutable. It's simply the beginningless flux of karma. So one can just simply accept where one finds oneself to be in a given place and do the best they can with whatever they have. And if they're dutiful in that, then in the context of eternity, in a relatively short period of time, due to the graciousness of Bhagavan and sadhus, more and more opportunity, facility, favorability will come to them.
Yeah, thank you.
Unlike, of course, the money world, where there's no guarantee that you might be a billionaire and then a pauper next week. At least in the world of bhakti, there's some grace and some support for you. It's not just loan sharks and cutthroat deals and all this kind of stuff.
Yes. It's because somebody who is born in opposite side of the world and all opposite conditions may come to conclusion or just contemplation. Oh gosh, what's the hope? What's the point? And then brings to mind the things that I heard from someone who was studying Jiva long ago before I came to Babaji, like 20 years ago, maybe more. He said that Jiva Gosvami said, maybe you can confirm that, Jiva Gosvami says that when Jiva meets sadhu, it's only a question of time when it gets liberated from samsara. Just a question of time, simple as that. But the meeting of sadhu is crucial, beginning of it. Just for that personal thought. Thank you.
All right, well, we'll dive now into part 4, being far lower than even grass, Tṛṇādapi sunīcetva. The fourth quality mentioned in the verse under discussion is that of being far lower than even grass. At first hearing, one may wonder what virtue there is in considering oneself to be lower than an immobile tamasic entity that is considered the lowest of all living beings. The commentator on Padyavali dispels this concern by explaining that because grass is always situated on the earth, it exhibits the quality of having a disposition of humility. Thus, the mention in the verse under discussion of, quote, being far lower than even grass alludes to the quality of being humble, which is a quality of paramount importance for every bhakta of Sri Bhagavan, as will be elucidated ahead. Incidentally, the English words humble and humility, which are derived from the Latin word humus, meaning soil or ground, can be understood to convey the same idea, that of being grounded in the earth beneath even the grass growing over it. Some interpret the meaning of, quote, being far lower than even grass to allude to the characteristic observed in many grasses, of humbly bending over and deferring to the movements of those who step on them, but also swinging back up into their normal position thereafter. Interpreted in this way, being far lower than even grass indicates that one, like grass, both deferringly tolerates and facilitates others even when they cause oneself hardship, but one does not also raise one's head back up thereafter as grass does, meaning one does not retaliate, talk back, feel disturbed such that one has to resettle oneself, or even think highly of oneself for having acted humbly towards a person who causes one harm or disrespect. In gist, one shows the qualities of non-violence, tolerance, non-conceitedness, and differential respect. This interpretation of being far lower than even grass, which is given by a number of commentators on the verse, however, can be considered to bear the fault of redundancy, since the qualities of tolerating aggressors without losing one's own inner equilibrium, of being free from conceit, and of being respectful are also amply indicated in the verse by the mention of the qualities of being tolerant like a tree, being non-conceited, and being respectful. It is thus noteworthy that in the Bengali explanations of being far lower than even grass given in Chaitanya Charitamrita, no specific reference is made to the intrinsic characteristics observed in grass of tolerating aggressors, causing no harm to others, bending over upon being pressured, and so forth, as were noted extensively in the explanation of being tolerant like a tree. Rather, only two quite simple explanations are given in regard to this quality of being far lower than even grass. Quote, being lower than even grass, one should continuously take the name. And quote, even while being exalted, one still considers oneself lower than grass. By means of a precise reading of this second explanation, it can be said that the mention in the verse under discussion of, quote, being far lower than even grass, refers primarily to a feeling of lowliness in regard to oneself. And the mention of grass to illustrate this lowliness is not made primarily with reference to any specific extrinsic characteristics of grass, other than its being low to the ground. Furthermore, in this regard, the exact nature of the feeling of lowliness alluded to by the mention of, quote, being far lower than even grass, is also evidently something other than being in general free from conceit and being respectful, or deferring, since there would again arise a redundancy in the meaning of the verse if, quote, being far lower than even grass did not indicate something more than respectfulness and non-conceitedness. So I'll pause here for a sec. So as we discussed regarding the quality of amāninā, there were two interpretations given by different commentators. One of being free from conceit, as was found in the Charitamrita and reflected in the works of Sanatana Gosvami, and the other being non-desirous of honor, as was given in commentaries on the Bhagavatam by Sri Rupa Gosvami, Jiva Gosvami, and Vishwanath Chakravarti. So if you take the amāninā quality in the second sense of not desiring honor, then to characterize Tṛṇād sunīcena as being referent to a quality of being free from pride or free from conceit or without egotism wouldn't entirely be redundant. So that can then justify why some commentators have explained it that way. So we're not here to poo-poo on anybody's commentary. There is a way where that can conceptually make sense. But if we take the statement as it's interpreted directly in the Charitamrita and by some of the commentators on the verse itself as being not conceited, then to say that being humble and being not proud, I mean, if you look up these things in a dictionary, they're almost synonymous. So you arrive at what can seem like a redundancy, and in a short verse like this, which is, composed in a very straightforward manner, that you would have a redundancy like this would be quite odd. So we'll take it that there couldn't be any such redundancy, and therefore that this quality of being lower than grass has to be something more, that, or at least distinct from the idea of not being conceited or not being egotistical, in order for there to be non-redundancy in what's being said. So, support for this distinction, perhaps a subtle distinction, is found in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, and specifically the commentary of Sanatana Gosvami on the definition that he gives of humility. So, this is what we discuss next. Sri Sanatana Gosvami Pad's definition and discussion of humility in Brihad Bhagavatamrita is thus insightful in this regard, because it elucidates a distinction between non-conceitedness, amāninā, and humility, dainya, two different qualities which appear conflated in explanations of the verse under discussion given by some commentators. So, Sanatana Gosvami defines dainya, or humility, as follows: that by which a sense of oneself being exceptionally incapable and lowly shall exist continuously in the mind, even when one is endowed with all excellence, is called humility, dainya, by the wise. So if we look at this definition and we compare it to the interpretation given in the Antyalila of this quality of Tṛṇād sunīcena, we see that they are quite parallel, right? Earlier we read, even while being exalted, one still considers oneself lower than grass. And here he's saying that that by which a sense of being exceptionally incapable and lowly exists in the mind even when one is endowed with all excellence is called humility. So we can see that the way that Kaviraj Goswami, as presenting the teaching of Mahaprabhu, has rendered the idea of Tṛṇād sunīcena, sunicatva, directly parallels the way Sanatana Gosvami has defined the term dainya, or humility, in Brihad Bhagavatamrita. So in that way we can say that being lower than grass is equivalent to, or can be considered a metaphoric way of speaking of the quality known as humility, or dainya. Now, to get into the distinction between humility and non-conceitedness, we look at the commentary of Sanatana Gosvami. So, pardon me if this seems like hair-splitting for anybody, but I found this distinction quite valuable, and as we see as the discussion develops, I think it leads to some quite profound understanding. So, to introduce this definition of humility that he gives, Sanatana Gosvami raises the following question. Well, by the word humility, dainya, do you mean poverty, daridram, or being possessionless, akinchanatva, because of relinquishment of acquisition, that is, non-retention of any possessions, or non-conceitedness, nirabhimanitva, and the like, or otherwise? So he's speaking specifically of nirabhimanitva, or amanitva, as saying, is that what you mean by humility? In other words, is when you speak of humility, is that equivalent to what we call non-conceitedness, or being free from abhiman? Or is what you call humility something else? So then he goes to give the definition, and thus by giving the definition, and not by agreeing to that suggestion, we have a direct implication that humility is not simply equivalent to non-conceitedness, or amanitva. To this, Sri Narada says, Yena, he speaks this verse, that by which a mentality of being exceptionally, that is distinctly in comparison to people in general, incapable, that is unable to do anything, and lowly, that is base, shall exist continuously in the mind, is called humility by the wise. By reference to the question raised here in the commentary, as to whether humility is synonymous with non-conceitedness, it can be understood that humility, and so also, quote, being far lower than even grass, does not refer redundantly to being free from conceit, that is, to being free from all worldly forms of egotism, but rather to something more than this. To further clarify the exact nature of this feeling of incapability and lowliness that is called humility, or dainya, Sri Sanatana raises an objection to his commentary regarding how it is defined in the first half of the verse. Quote, well, then in the case of such a definition, that, meaning humility, can come about even as a result of enactment of wrongful action, as a consequence of abandoning rightful action out of laziness or otherwise. In other words, so humility means thinking that you're really low and incapable. So I'm lazy, I don't do anything, I do nonsense, so I'm low, I'm incapable, so I'm humble. Someone could, if you leave the definition just as it's given in the first half, you could arrive at that line of thought. That, yeah, I don't do anything, I'm just a bum, I'm just a lazy guy, I'm just a nonsense guy, I don't do anything good, I'm a low person, I'm an incapable person, and I have that awareness in my mind all the time. Therefore, I'm very humble. So that is not what Sanatana Gosvami means by humility. So to preclude that idea, then the following a qualifier is given in the second half of the verse, and is elaborated on later in the commentary. Sri Sanatana raises this objection to clarify that the humility being defined here is not to be confused with depression, a lack of self-respect, a lack of self-confidence, or excessive preoccupation with one's own shortcomings or wrongful behavior. As a result of laziness and other defects, such as lust, anger, and greed, people are known to neglect to perform rightful actions and instead perform wrongful actions. If one finds oneself in this way unable to refrain from committing wrongful actions, one may very well consider oneself to be exceptionally incapable and lowly. Feeling that way for these reasons, that is, because of one's own evident faults, however, is not what is referred to by the term humility being defined in this verse. To preclude that understanding, Sri Sanatana adds in the second half of the verse the qualifier, quote, even when one is endowed with all excellence, which was also there in the statement rendering the Tṛṇād sunīcena phrase in the Charitamrita as, even while being exalted, one still considers oneself lower than grass. So, this qualifier, even when one is endowed with all excellence, which indicates that the feeling of being, quote, exceptionally incapable and lowly, spoken of in the definition, is not an outcome of faults or a lack of good qualities within oneself, but rather arises in spite of honorable behavior and the presence of good qualities within oneself. In other words, if you're not already a person with sufficient qualities, the humility, which is a very high virtue, is more or less out of reach. To be, dysfunctional and to recognize your own dysfunction, that doesn't meet the grade of what is called humility in this case. While that's also fine and good to have a clear perception of what one's own situation may be, here the way the word humility is being defined is something of a finer nature. So one has to be already highly capable and virtuous to get to the point where then one could acquire and foster this exalted quality of what he is calling dainya. So he elaborates on this further in the commentary that follows. Quote, acute disconcertion, or parama vyagram, which is a little bit of an uncommon word. Loosely in more common speech in Bengali, it becomes bakul. In other words, to be in a state of unrest or uneasiness. The word anxiety now has strong connotations in mental health discourse, so it's not quite suitable in this case, but if you think of it in the less connotated modern sense, it could also be used as a translation here. So in this state of acute disconcertion, that is a cause of weeping and so on, as a result of reflection on the dangers of samsara and so forth, even when one is endowed with all excellence, that is, qualities and so on, as a result even of apt observance of injunctions and prohibitions and so on, because of the absence of egotism, is called humility. This is the purport. So in other words, if one first of all doesn't have this quality of non-conceitedness or non-egotism, there's not even scope for feeling this quality of humility. So first of all, one has to be free from egotism or conceit. Then one has to have a number of virtues. And then on top of that, one has to still feel a sense of lowliness or a state of disconcertion within oneself because of a deeper or a broader concern that one has, such as the existential plight of worldly existence, as is given here, or, quote, the dangers of samsara. And we'll get into what Sanatana Gosvami says as, and so forth, in a minute. So this point is important. In other words, he's showing how humility is a meta virtue, if you will. It already requires a number of virtues in order to have this very fine virtue as he's defining it. So here, Sri Sanatana indicates that the state of being endowed with all types of excellence within samsara, such as the excellences of being endowed with great virtues, wealth, nobility, education, and renown, can be attained not only by following the path of bhakti, but also even by means of following the various injunctions and prohibitions given for the path of karma. Regardless of how such excellences are acquired, however, the primary underlying requisite in all cases to retain such excellences is that one is free from egotism, which is a point that was discussed earlier with reference to the quality of non-conceitedness, amāninā, and which Sri Sanatana Pad also makes elsewhere, as was quoted earlier. Quote, non-egotism, or nirahankarata, alone is shown to be the underlying basis of all good qualities. When one is free from egotism, that is conceit, then one can acquire and sustain one's acquisition of all types of excellence within the world. The quality of humility is thus, like other virtues, predicated upon non-egotism, that is, non-conceitedness, amāninā. But humility, dainya, according to Sri Sanatana Pad, is itself something more than that, since he has defined it as, quote, acute disconcertion, that is the cause of weeping and so forth, as a result of reflection on the dangers of samsara and so forth, on the part of those who are free from egotism and endowed with various excellent characteristics. When one has ample worldly qualities and opportunities, yet still feels a sense of inner unrest, by virtue of understanding the plight of being subject to worldly existence, that is samsara itself, then it can be said that the quality of humility has arisen in a person's heart. So, what I personally find interesting is determining what Sanatana refers to as the etc., or the adi, and so on, in addition to the plight of material existence. In other words, is concern for one's existential state in samsara the only meta-consideration that can inspire humility in the heart? So he doesn't elaborate in that commentary that we've discussed so far about other causes, but a lot of what we're going to discuss in the coming classes is basically filling in the blank here about what are other things that can inspire that state of unrest or disconcertion in the heart of a person who's largely free from egotism and largely endowed with many other virtues. In other words, when one is otherwise a very good person, so to speak, yet still feels this sense of lowliness or incapability due to concern with some higher, more finer aspiration and ideal, then one acquires, or one is said to have, what Sanatana Gosvami is defining here as humility. So what are those other underlying drivers that give rise to that sense of unrest or that sense of disconcertion in the heart? That we'll discuss in the coming classes. And in that way, we'll get further understanding about what is alluded to by this idea of being lower than grass. So for today, I'll stop here, and whenever we get to it again, we'll go further into this subject matter. So if anyone has any comments or questions on what we've gone through so far, please feel free to share. Oops. Yes.
Is it me?
Yes.
Okay. So I would like to just contemplate a little bit on this fact that someone may feel incapable of law, and what causes this. Because from whatever I studied so far, it shows that the awareness of greatness of Bhagavan, its creation, and one's all placement in this creation makes one humble. So basically, you can say knowledge, but not knowledge to know things, but knowledge of appreciating the greatness of where we are in the context of our existence. But of course, you said the discussion will be done more on on samsara being the main cause of this community. So what I'm saying is that being basically not only aware of greatness of Bhagavan, but also being perplexed with the complexities of life as well. It's so tangling. If somebody lives some samsara life and has some peeking to spirituality, the person may feel completely incapable of handling life, and thus being able to, evoke some kind of humility in the heart. The one thing, but the realization, awareness, okay, but then the main, actually, of course we'll be discussing this later, but what will be the main inspiration or cause of sustaining that kind of consciousness? Because occasionally someone may feel, oh, I'm humble, this and that, and things goes wrong and things go completely complex. And sometimes there are moments of realization, oh great, I'm so low, and growth is so great. But there are moments that the jiva may forget. And if you feel, I would say, not complacent, I'll be feeling maybe more assertive, and may forget actually its own humility. So what is being said is that maintaining that kind of consciousness of being lowly is the sign of humility, not really awakening to the fact that will come and go, but actually sustaining that understanding of one's own incapability, despite of all one's qualities. Am I getting it correctly? Like maintaining that kind of understanding, not just being aware of it temporarily, but actually living it. Yeah, I think that's the. You can help me to formulate that. Perhaps that the maintenance of the humility consciousness would that be the main thing that will actually define oneself as humble. It's a kind of statement. I'm throwing this for maybe discussion. If you wish to elaborate on that.
Sure. Well, I mean, many things that I could say to that will come up right in the content we get to next time. So I won't dive into that ahead of time.
Sure. Okay.
But one thing I will say is that I just a personal reflection related to the topic as well as translation is that although I'm using the word humility here to translate the word dainya, I also worry that can create a gap, something can get lost in translation, so to speak. Because, at least for me, when I think of the word humility, there can also be a sense of that word evoking a sense of peace, like in the sense of groundedness or like restfulness or something like this. Like to be in a humble position is to be like cool, calm, accepting. It can have a connotation or a leaning in that direction. But what we see here in the way Sanatana Gosvami is using the word dainya specifically, the word dainya is derived from the word dina. And so the word dina can also refer to a poor person or a person who's in like a grief-stricken or a pitiable situation. So to be dina, the way he says, where he raised this question, when you say dainya, do you mean poverty? Or do you mean having no possessions? In other words, the idea of dina or dainya can refer to something that's a rather abject, unpleasant state of being, such as being poor, such as having nothing, but not always, right? He says, or do you mean non-conceitedness, or what do you mean? So then he's clarifying this, but if we look again at then, not in the verse itself, but in the tika, how he uses this word parama vayagram, or this acute disconcertion, or this acute state of unrest. So, like if you're in a building with a fire going on it, you're not necessarily gonna, keep flicking on your phone, or, scrolling through a feed. Like, you're not gonna feel at ease with that. You're gonna feel like there's a clear and present danger in front of me. You're gonna automatically feel a certain state of disconcertion due to the abject danger that you're in. So similarly, when he's using initially this mention of existential angst, if you will, if we kind of pull what he's saying, if awareness of the dangers or the suffering of samsara, when one has acute sense of the plight of samsara in comparison to spiritual ideals or spiritual attainments that could otherwise be where one is situated, then one can see that they're as though in a ship that's sinking, or as though in a building that's on fire. They're as though in a situation which is not a situation that is where you're kind of comfortable and content to hang out in. There just is like an existential sense of unrest in one's embodied condition, if you will, that I have this human birth. I may lose it at any moment. There's no guarantee of when I will die. If I don't use this human birth to achieve whatever spiritual ideal I have no idea when I'll get this chance again. Like, I have this incredibly precious, rare opportunity that I need to use, urgently. That sense of disconcertion or unrest, he's giving stress to, or in his definition of humility, he's pushing on that side of the connotation that the word dainya can evoke. So I don't feel that the English word humility captures that side of the connotation of the word as well as the word dainya can.
Yeah, I think so.
So that's why I find that this point he gives in the commentary is so important. And so coming to your point about sustained consciousness or sustained awareness of this is my 2 cents on the topic, is he's talking about, someone having such a perspective that simply by virtue of their perspective, they retain this sense of urgency or this sense of disconcertion about their existential condition. That much we can say about this initial cause for the feeling of reference to the plight of samsara. But what is more interesting, in my opinion, is the other causes for that sense of disconcertion or for that sense of unrest that come up in other places where Sanatana Gosvami discusses this point in Brihad Bhagavatamrita and other texts. So next time, we'll get into other drivers, if you will, that lead to that retained, so to speak, awareness or that retained sense of disconcertion or urgency, which is, as it goes without saying, is highly conducive to sustained engagement in spiritually progressive activity. Just as, if you're trying to motivate someone to, move somewhere, the fact that they're on a sinking ship or in a burning building is one of the best motivations that there could be. In other words, when the person can clearly perceive the imminent problem of remaining in their present condition, they're highly motivated to now move out of it. So humility is so spiritually auspicious, so to speak, because it's such an effective driver for the person actively engaging in what is spiritually uplifting. That's what comes to mind on the topic.
Thank you. This is important, I think, because there's huge misunderstanding somewhere else. I don't want to mention where, but all over, in places where humility is equated with the present state of existence. And actually, it may lead, in some cases, to personal, completely like depression. psychological depression, if one may not understand what it is. But he's sincere trying to practice. It happens to some who try to become so humble, so to the ground, that actually they lost an impetus to live in life, but maintaining themselves and so forth. And, and also this leads me to another question, to whom actually Rupa Gosvami is talking in his books. Is he talking to vairagi or aspiring vairagis, or just across the board to everybody? Grihastas, who are deep down, up to the neck in activities of samsara, they have to fight and show assertiveness and be bold and, elbows up, pushing through, maintaining this assertiveness of the ego, actually, in order to actually exist in the world. Or is he talking to those who are actually denounce everything and ready to completely give themselves up to the Lord in a humble state of mind, without any obligations towards material, having no material obligations? So, I had this question for a long time, actually. Maybe you can clarify, whom is actually Rupa Goswami preaching or teaching to? Who he is addressing this book, Padyavali?
Well, Jiva Goswami says the Sandarbhas are for those whose one aspiration or whose one aim is bhakti. So they don't necessarily make a householder renunciate distinction, but we can say primarily it's for people who have the adhikar for the path of bhakti as they define it in these works. They may be a grihasta, they may not be. But for those who have shraddha in the Bhagavat, shraddha in these works, then this is for them. And by virtue of that shraddha, by virtue of the taste that they have for Bhagavat Katha, then, they can appreciate these things. And then, as deep as they go, as far as they dive, the better. And even if some of the teachings may be difficult or seem not applicable in their stage, it's still valuable to hear them, it's still valuable to know that those things are part of the path, and sometimes even hearing about things that are beyond one's present level of practice can also inspire one to go at least towards that from where one is at present. Rather than, if one never hears about, so to speak, further levels, they can also get a sort of hollow sense of how far along they are or how deep they have to go. And that can sometimes lead to complacency. So even to hear about things that might seem out of reach can also have a motivating and an inspiring effect. All right, well, let's conclude here for today. And in our next discussion, we'll go further into what we might call drivers for humility, or other frames of reference or ideals that are cherished, which can give rise to this sense of urgency or this sense of disconcertion in the heart of those who cherish and aspire for those aims. So, a most sublime and a most important subject for those who aspire to follow the path shown by the Goswamis, the path taught by Mahaprabhu. The quality of humility or dainya is, you could say, quintessential to that of Vaishnavata. So to see how our Goswamis have elaborated and illuminated what that spirit is very much to the heart of the path of bhakti. So I conclude here. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Guru, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.